That post-war architecture, the architecture of the 1950s and the 1960s, it kind of encapsulates the sort of the dreams and aspirations of that era, you know, like these kind of new prefabricated buildings and stuff like that, where, you know, and this idea of building kind of high, of building kind of tower blocks and stuff like that. And I think now, looking back, and something that was even apparent at the time was the way that that architecture kind of embodied those kind of utopian dreams and aspirations of that kind of post-war settlement. And I have always been really fascinated by that architecture, and I've photographed it here in Hull on Orchard Park, but also in places like, you know, the new towns like Cumbernauld in Scotland as well. And it's something about being curious about the legacy of those dreams and those kind of unfulfilled futures and the way that they kind of haunt the present. At the time I was kind of looking to make the images that became the Orchard Park images, I was looking for empty kind of residential buildings, houses, bungalows, apartments to photograph in. And Vernon House itself was pure chance. What had happened was that the council had cleared the building with a view to demolishing it. And then somebody had realized that they couldn't demolish it, even though they'd emptied it, because they'd leased the roof of the building to a mobile phone company for 20 years. So while they kind of sorted out the legalities of all of that, there was this building that was never meant to still be there. They were going to demolish it straight away. And I managed to get access to it through the council. And it was one of the really high-rise blocks. I think it was 22 stories. It had about 122 apartments in it. It was really intense. And most of the time I was there on my own. I did occasionally manage to persuade friends to come and kind of accompany me. But for the most part, I was there on my own. And it was, you know, if you can imagine being in a building with 122 apartments, which may be empty, but may not be. And I visited all of the apartments. And whichever apartment I was in, I always had this sense that there were other presences, other people in the building, just out of sight, just somewhere else. So it was quite, there was always this heightened sense of awareness, of listening for all the sounds in the building. And it was kind of counterintuitively, it was a building that was full of sounds, because, you know, you would have, a lot of the windows were broken, so pigeons would come and go from the building, so you'd hear pigeons coming in and out. Every apartment in the building had been fitted with smoke alarms. So, and you know, in smoke alarms, the batteries run down, they make that little chirruping noise to tell you that the batteries need replacing. So all the time I was in the building, there was this constant soundtrack it was like the building was kind of singing to itself, with all of these kind of just chirruping smoke alarms right through the building. If you stood in the stairwell, you know, 22 stories of stairwell, you could hear all of them kind of playing away. People had just left things, and there was an element of like prying into people's very private lives, you know, and there was a different one, obviously, being a different story behind every single door. And I remember going into one apartment and I found these diaries that somebody had left, and they recorded things like watching other people, particular people, moving backwards and forwards across the estate who they'd kind of watched. And they weren't sinister, you know, they were just kind of thinking about like these other people, the lives of these other people moving back and forth across the estate. So you also had this sense of needing to be respectful as well, because although the people had gone, there was this real sense of, you know, of still having this very privileged access to the things that they'd left behind. It was very eerie, and it didn't help that they would have to, you know, for my own safety, they would lock me in the building when I went in there. And in areas still, because I'd use the lift to go up and down through all the stories, and it wasn't really being maintained, and so it would kind of pause occasionally between floors, and there was no light in the lift. So yeah, it was a really unsettling experience. The process that I used to make the Orchard Park images, it's quite unusual and it's quite complex. They are photographs, and in fact they are photographs of photographs. So I knew that I wanted to try and capture things like the fall of light in kind of unoccupied rooms. And I wanted to make images that were somehow removed from the everyday. But of course I was photographing in real apartments, real homes that were full of the decor that people had chosen, sometimes their possessions, and all of those things had real individual characters. And when I started making the images in the apartments, I was photographing on colour slide film, sort of transparencies that you could project. And of course, I did photograph the light pouring into the rooms, but those images were very grounded in the everyday, in the little details of people's lives. And I wanted to try and find a way of shifting them away from that grounding in the everyday. And I developed this process whereby I could make images like the ones that you see in the Orchard Park work, but they were very ephemeral. They only lasted about an hour. And those images were made by projecting colour transparencies, colour slides, like the ones I was using to make the images in the apartments, and projecting them onto very large panels of wood coated in phosphorescent paint, the kind of safety paint that you find in buildings for when the power fails. And I discovered that if you projected a photograph onto this paint, you got basically a photographic image. It was a photographic process. The paint is sensitive to light. When you project an image onto it, you get a photographic image. But unlike a photographic print, a traditional black and white or colour analog photographic print, which is fixed, so you can look at it in daylight, these images could only be seen in the dark, completely darkened spaces, and they had a life of about an hour. And as soon as you made these images by projecting them onto the panels, they began to fade. So somebody kind of in the space with them would have the experience where there was a point where they were no longer sure whether they could see the image or whether they could just remember it. I discovered, because I thought that you couldn't re-photograph those images, that they were so faint that they would just fade away and disappear and they couldn't be photographed. And then I kind of discovered that you could do it. So the images that you see in the gallery are re-photographed from those phosphorescent panels. So it's 20 years this year since I made the Orchard Park work. And I suppose if I reflect back on them now, one of the things that I'm really struck by is that at the time, I thought that what I was doing was all about what was in the rooms, and it was about the process, it was about the light, it was about looking into the legacy of these lives. And I think now, when I look at them, and I look at them in the context of the other work that I've made, I realise that they're far more autobiographical, that they're actually far more about what I brought to Vernon House, as much as what I found there. And a lot of the work that I've made since, or more recently, has been about silences. And by silences, I mean things that are unspoken or unheard in different relationships or institutions. And it's hard for me now not to see the Orchard Park images as part of that body of work, which is kind of examining silences and things that are repressed or unsaid, but also things that seem to be absent, that things that seem at first glance to be full of absences or silences. But actually, when you investigate them or you consider them a little more, you realize that far from empty, they're absolutely full of things, And I think that's the thing that's probably one of the things that strikes me really powerfully about the work now. And I suppose one of the strange things about photographing in the building was that I was coming to the building at the very end of its life, just before it was due to be demolished. It had been emptied, it was due to be demolished. And so in a sense, I was, I suppose, coming in and recording inadvertently the life of the legacy or the life of that building, and with it, the legacy of those aspirations and dreams that had led to the building of Vernon House and Orchard Park. There was something about the fact that these were images that were kind of caught in the act of fading, of degrading, of disappearing. And that seemed to really resonate with the status of the building itself, that was kind of reaching the end of its life and was somehow being captured in these photographs as it reached that point. So there was a kind of a synergy between the process and the work that brought everything together for me in a really interesting way. Even now, when I look at the images, I think they're unsettling. They disturb me. And that's despite living with them for 20 years. I find them quite melancholy. I find them in some ways very, very sad images, particularly the ones where you see furniture, chairs that almost seem to stand in for bodies. I still find them fascinating. I still want to look at them. And to some extent, they still don't feel like images that I made. They feel as though they were images that happened, and I helped them happen. But there's a sense, in a way, of not feeling ownership of them. And I think that means that when I come to them, I still come to them new. I still come to them with a certain fascination. I can't quite believe that they exist.